Well, I have 11 o'clock, so I think we should get started. Welcome, everyone, to another Saturday webinar made possible by the Ashbrook Center, which is an independent center at Ashbrook University, offering a number of resources to help teachers teach young citizens what it means to be Americans. I'm Chris Burkett, Associate Professor of Political Science and History and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. The purpose of these webinars is to pull together some thoughtful scholars, and we've got two very thoughtful scholars today, just to have a conversation about some important ideas. This year's theme is Presidents and Their Times. And so today we're talking about Theodore Roosevelt at the dawn of a new era, and we've recommended some readings. Hopefully you had a chance to look at some of those. We'll be possibly pointing to those and drawing from those documents throughout our conversation today. I'll just remind you at the beginning, and I'll remind you at the end of the webinar as well, that in the next week you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation if you would like one. Let me introduce our panelists. Peter Myers is Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. He is the author of two books, Our Only Star and Compass, Locke on the Struggle for Political Rationality, and Frederick Douglass, Race and the Rebirth of American Liberalism. Pete teaches regularly in our Master of Arts program on courses that have included Race and Equality in America, a course on Frederick Douglass, and a course called Democracy in America, which was one of our great text courses. Paul Moreno is the William and Bernice Grucock Chair in Constitutional History at Hillsdale College, and is also the Director of Academic Programs at the college's Alan Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, which is in Washington, D.C. He's the author of Black Americans and Organized Labor, A New History, and The American State from the Civil War to the New Deal, The Twilight of Constitutionalism and the Triumph of Progressivism. Paul is also taught in our Master of Arts program, and I think most recently Paul was with me in a course on the Progressive Era.
Yep, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Well, we're trying to get you back soon. So thanks to both of you for being here. It's great to see you. Let me just start with a broad theoretical question, and then you two, of course, can take it any direction you like. Maybe it's not theoretical simply, but a broad sort of scholarly question about Roosevelt's place in American history. I'll start with two big questions that I think are related. One is from the perspective of progressives, right? We often teach Theodore Roosevelt as being at the sort of forefront of the progressive movement. But from the perspective of other progressives, there is some question as to how progressive Theodore Roosevelt was. Of course, he called himself a progressive. He ran as the candidate endorsed by the Progressive Party. But there are other progressive scholars and thinkers at the time who I think were skeptical to a certain extent of Roosevelt. So there's that sort of lingering question. Maybe you'd want to start by addressing that. And the second my second question arises from one of the documents which we recommended students read, which is The Heirs of Abraham Lincoln. And I thought it might be interesting to explore the extent to which Roosevelt actually was an heir to Abraham Lincoln. How is that a legitimate claim on his part when he claims that progressives, especially progressives of his ilk, were in fact the true heirs of Abraham Lincoln? So I'll throw those two broad questions out. Feel free to ignore both of them if you like. And tell us what you think is significant about Roosevelt. Another question we could actually, in a broad sense, hopefully we will address is it has to do with the title of the seminar, The Dawn of a New Era. In what ways did Roosevelt usher in this new era? What is the new era? How is it new? And what was Roosevelt's role in it? So I'll stop talking and turn it over to either of you to start with your thoughts on the significance of Roosevelt.
If I may, I think the Lincoln analogy is absolutely on point, because Roosevelt, like Lincoln, is somebody who people on both the left and the right have laid claim to, and also who's been attacked by people on the left and the right as not being part of their tradition. My friend at Hillsdale College, R.J. Pastrito, wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago denouncing those Republicans who were claiming Theodore Roosevelt as, sort of what the ideological founder of the modern Republican Party, that he was actually a progressive. And the way in which Roosevelt and also Wilson tried very consciously to make Abraham Lincoln, to make that claim that Lincoln was one of their, that they were continuing the Lincolnian tradition, has also been subject to a lot of historical debate. A guy named Javiden recently wrote a whole book about Wilson and Lincoln. So these claims are being made about who are the legitimate heirs of the Republicans and who are the original progressives is, I think, right at the heart of the historical controversy.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Just if I can just throw in really quickly, it's not insignificant, of course, that Roosevelt starts out as a Republican, right?
Yep.
A certain kind of Republican, of course. But Paul, Pete, please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, just I would make a couple of scattered points maybe, and maybe we can develop them down the road. On the to continue with the theme of the relation to Abraham Lincoln, I guess I would second what Paul says, that you see this very obviously, and I mean, actually people like us and those we support in the political world tend to claim Abraham Lincoln as continuation of the original principles of the founders. And on the other hand, the president himself, used to make a very big point of advertising his basic, as he saw it, his basic continuity with Abraham Lincoln. So it's people on both sides of the fence. I guess I would say something a little more pointed about that. I at the end of the discussion, I would take the position that the discontinuities are ultimately more significant than the continuities between TR and Abraham Lincoln. And the short way to say that, I guess, is to say that Lincoln, in virtually all respects, counsels a kind of principled reverence for the founders of the Republic. That is, the constitutional founders, as well as the authors of the Declaration of Independence. And Roosevelt doesn't. I mean, earlier in his career, he has very laudatory things to say about the Federalist Papers, but Roosevelt either counsels a really pretty dramatic reinterpretation of the founders' Constitution, or an equally dramatic, simple modification of it. And I think his fundamental principles are really very different from the founders' fundamental principles, which were the fundamental principles of Lincoln. And I mean, to say all of that in a more concentrated way, I think Abraham Lincoln showed, despite what's really a significant expansion of executive power in the Civil War, Lincoln showed a very scrupulous respect for the constitutional limitations of his office, and Theodore Roosevelt doesn't. I mean, I think Theodore Roosevelt interprets the powers of the executive as very, very expansive. Powers of the national government generally, but especially the executive branch, in a very, very expansive way. And I think that's ultimately a departure. I'll stop there. I guess we didn't address your question, first of all, about how progressive TR was, but maybe we can get to that.
Well, I think they're actually kind of related. If I may just for a second think out loud, your point about Roosevelt at least pays some lip service, not just to the framers of the Constitution, but the authors of the Declaration of Independence, at least early in his career. But then, of course, it seems to me he shifts a little bit later to talking about human rights, the idea of human rights instead of individual natural rights. And that, I remember reading Herbert Crowley's as a critique of Roosevelt, maybe the earlier Roosevelt, because as Crowley puts it, he still adheres to what he calls the Jeffersonian bondage. That is, this Jeffersonian idea that individual rights matter somehow more than the sort of general welfare or collective rights of society as a whole. That may be a case of an earlier Roosevelt versus a later Roosevelt, which is another question I wanted to ask you both about, whether we can say Roosevelt was consistent throughout his career in terms of his political thought. But Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, it certainly looks like there's Roosevelt as the president, the Republican Roosevelt, as John Morton Blum, I think, wrote a book by that title. And then the Roosevelt of 1912, the outright progressive who breaks up the Republican Party and paves the way for Woodrow Wilson. And it's also, I think, that Roosevelt was not an intellectual. He wasn't a scholar the way that Wilson was. Wilson's theoretical attack on the founders was much more explicit and started much earlier. Roosevelt was more a man of action. In some ways, I think it's usually said that Crowley provided a kind of intellectual framework that sort of gave Roosevelt sort of an intellectual basis for what he felt or what he was doing, but he had not sort of theorized about. So that's another reason why I think Wilson has overshadowed Roosevelt, especially recently among scholars of progressivism, is because Wilson has a much longer paper trail.
Yeah, oh, that's very interesting. And it seems to me that then Roosevelt in some, okay, let me try to do it this way. It seems as though if there might be two Roosevelts. There's the earlier Roosevelt, who still in a way pays at least lip service to the founders, but then later becomes much more progressive in the sense that I think of progressives. That is, he starts calling for more direct democracy reforms, for example, and gets on board with a lot of the things that are eventually listed in the Progressive Party platform that he didn't necessarily advocate earlier on. So either there are two Roosevelts, or maybe we want to say an evolving Roosevelt, to be generous to him, or he simply doesn't see the contradictions inherent in those two ways of thinking about things. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on on how we think about Roosevelt. He's an enigma in many ways in terms of what he actually thinks.
Yeah, I think well, a couple of things that you're onto something, and Crowley's onto something in calling attention to contradictions. But at least I'm not sure Crowley's entirely right about that. I mean, I think in a certain sense, there is a kind of contradiction in Roosevelt's thinking, really from start to finish, that you could describe by the general terms the conflict between the individualism and the collectivism. But I'm not sure the individualism ever really was a devotion to anything like the founders, or anything really close to the founders' idea of individual rights. I think it's more that throughout Roosevelt's career, there is this stress on individual virtue, on a sense of duty. Um, and he uses the phrase repeatedly, the right stuff, in his autobiography, and he says none of these heroic governmental enterprises that I'm advocating are really going to work unless we have the right stuff in individuals. And I think maybe there's a certain tension between the Roosevelt as the proponent of great heroic individual virtue, a kind of self-reliance. That all seems very traditionally American. And Roosevelt, who tends to conceive of the majority of Americans by this point as being victimized, really, by a relatively small oligarchic elite, and therefore in need of the help of a very powerful, increasingly powerful federal government to protect them or to redress their grievances. And I'm not sure Roosevelt ever saw, I think he probably didn't ever really see, that the efforts to redress on the part of the government might themselves be corrupting of the kind of virtue that he wants to cultivate. So in that way, I see a certain contradiction. But on the other hand, it's a meaningful thing. I think that in this, I think maybe with different words, I second what Paul says, that it's a meaningful thing that Roosevelt reads Crowley and loves him immediately, right? And Roosevelt says in his autobiography that it was really about the middle 1890s that he started to see that this impulse toward reform, just first of all, this anti-corruption reform, that was driving his early political career has much broader implications. And so I kind of think the seeds of the progressivism were really always there. And so there's not a great big change. It's just that he's very intellectually ambitious in a certain way, but he was not a theoretical guy, and maybe in the way that Woodrow Wilson was. And so it took him a while to see the full theoretical scope of the moralistic reform impulse that was always driving him. But I'll stop with that for now, I guess.
Well, that's very interesting because in all of that insight, Pete, you reminded me that we think of Roosevelt personally as this sort of bull of a man, right? I mean, a bull moose of a man, and he's the epitome of rugged individualism in a sense, and he's constantly, you know, talking about the virtues of self-reliance on the one hand, but on the other hand, you're right. I mean, in the context of when he's president and then running later in 1912 for president, he sees the ordinary common man as the victim to, as you put it, this oligarchic elite. And recognizes that if rugged individualism is to have a chance, that before that can happen, you have to have government that intervenes on their behalf and gives them those kinds of opportunities. So it's an interesting thing. But what I was just going to say really quickly is the way you describe that, I think, provides some insight into what he means when he uses that phrase. That the president, the executive, is a steward of the people. One of the things we talk a lot about in my classes is what he means by that term steward. It's not simply somebody who serves, but it's somebody in a way who intervenes on the behalf, does service to the people in a way by intervening on their behalf. Somehow, it's an interesting term that he uses when he calls the executive the steward. And of course, he portrays Lincoln as the chief, or the in a way, the epitome of what the executive as a steward should be. So there's a lot we can do with this, of course. So if I can just backtrack a little bit with regard to his admiration for Lincoln and his claims that he is acting in a Lincolnian way. It seems to me that, Pete, you mentioned the expansion of executive power earlier, and Roosevelt claims to be imitating Lincoln in that regard. We had a comment from Joe quoting from that speech, I believe, where Roosevelt quotes Lincoln saying, "Capital has its rights." By the way, I encourage others who are joining us to please submit questions anytime you like in the chat box, and we'll get to those questions as much as possible. So I was hoping maybe we could say something about what does Roosevelt think about capital? Why does he use the term capital, which is an interesting term in itself, right? What does he think about property rights, and how does he influence and change the relationship of, let's just say, business to government?
If I could connect back to a point that was made earlier by Peter, that especially picking up on Crowley's idea of, the good. This is in a way that Crowley and Roosevelt are engaged in a revival of classical political ideas about the good life being the political life, about participating in the public life, in civic life, and especially in the military life. Roosevelt was, I think, fundamentally a military guy, used military metaphors all the time. His view of the Spanish-American War, I think, is a good illustration of this, where he thought that the United States was becoming, decadent, that commerce and business and capitalism were corroding the American character, and that we needed a good war every once in a while to revive the martial virtues and to bring forth the kind of sacrifice for the public good, that you see in Athens and Sparta. And Crowley, I think, again, you get a more elaborate, more articulate statement of this. But I think there, Crowley was sort of reaching into something that was very deep in Roosevelt's belief about what the good life is, and what he worried about the effects of business and capitalism. And in a way, that takes us back to the whole debate in the American founding about the place of modern liberalism, the commercial republic, versus the old-fashioned classical idea of republicanism.
Yeah, but it seems to me, it's striking to me that I could be wrong about this, but he talks about capital. And of course, Lincoln did use that term, but capitalism, that way of thinking about property is it sounds much more European in a way than it does American. At least I don't, you go back and you read the debates at the time of the founding or even in the early republic, that term capital doesn't get tossed around that much. The term capital is usually associated with socialism, I think, and I could be wrong about this, please correct me. We know, by the way, Roosevelt called himself a socialist, as he understood socialism. Is Roosevelt acting when he uses terms like this, or when he talks about property rights or the rights of capital? Is Roosevelt acting simply in accord with the sort of popular views at the time, or is he trying to change the way Americans think about property rights, or maybe it's both?
Well, I would.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, I would say that he was picking up on sort of the spirit of the age and the work of a lot of European intellectuals had started to seep into American political thought that rejected the idea of property or ownership in the traditional, for the founders, sort of John Locke natural rights tradition. That people had a natural right to property. That's one of the things, the principal thing that they form government to protect. This is the whole social contract, natural rights philosophy of the founding. And the progressives, on the other hand, regarded property as something that was instrumental. Property rights were something that you could adjust according to the needs of society, but they weren't something that the founders would have understood that term. People had a right to. Your right to property was only good insofar as it contributed to the public good. There was nothing really about an individual right to property or to anything else.
Yeah, that's actually that's one of the points I was gonna make. I think to maybe oversimplify slightly, the founders about property rights are Lockeans, and the idea. The Lockean idea is that you have a natural right to property because you have a natural right to your own person, which means your capacity to labor, among other things. That's the original property right, and from that it follows that wherever you labor, especially wherever you labor productively, you have a right in the product of your labor, and that's within large boundaries. That's irrespective of the use you make of it. So for Locke, there's the natural law limitation on accumulation is only. His language is that you have to leave as much and as good for others, but I think translated into more modern conditions, that means that you have to refrain from using your property in such a way that denies or obstructs others' opportunity to acquire. But the way that in the New Nationalism speech, the way that Roosevelt describes it, he says you have to earn your wealth by service to others. And the harder edged way of putting that would be to say that you really have no property rights unless they are put to the service of society, of the social good. He says, I don't remember if it's in that speech or another, he says, we will permit the accumulation of great wealth only if it benefits the community. So the property right for him is really socially derived in a way that it's not for Locke and for the founders. To add a further point, to come back to the thought about the relation to Lincoln and capital. When Roosevelt draws out his sense of that relation, he compares, as they've come to be known, the robber barons of his day, the industrialists of his day, with the slaveholders in Lincoln's day. And that seems to say, and he characterizes that as a dispute between property rights and human rights. But for Lincoln, the whole point of opposing slavery is to say that this is an illegitimate claim to property. This is not a conflict between property rights and human rights. There are no property rights in another human being. And so I think in that respect, the analogy with the slaveholders is entirely misbegotten, and it also speaks to a certain tendency to moralize and demonize his adversaries in a way that really is quite foreign to Lincoln. I mean, the last point I guess I would just toss out very briefly about that is that when the manner in which he speaks of the industrialists who he thinks are abusing their corporate trust uh, is highly moralistic, and in that respect, it much more resembles the abolitionists of Lincoln's day than it does Lincoln himself. I mean, Lincoln says about the slaveholders, look, they're just what we would be if we were in their circumstances, and on the other hand. TR gives this new nationalism speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, right? He's conjuring the spirit of John Brown, not Abraham Lincoln, this Old Testament warrior, which he considers really, I think, the true commencement of the Civil War. That's kind of an amazing fact. I mean, Lincoln thought John Brown was borderline insane, and TR links the two of them together and then links them both with him.
Yeah, that's a great point. He's the new nationalism speech is dedicating is it a park, a memorial park in the honor of John? Yeah, that's amazing.
And he calls it. Let me track it down and look it up quickly. He calls it. He says we're here to commemorate an epoch-making event in the long struggle for the rights of man. And the epoch-making event is John Brown's actions in Kansas, about which there's some ambiguity about who pulled the trigger and who did the actual killings and so forth. But they're very, very violent actions.
Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, Roosevelt goes on in the speech and says, we progressives today are fighting for exactly the same thing that they, I guess the people who thought like John Brown were fighting for leading up to and during the Civil War. So that's a great parallel. We have several good questions submitted by participants. All of them sort of related to what we're talking about. So I'm trying to figure out which one to start with. Actually, since we're on this topic, how about this one? Does Theodore Roosevelt get more radical on property rights post-presidency? And if so, my screen keeps jumping around. Sorry. Is it because he misses being the man in the arena, so he's sort of reacting from the desire to get back in the limelight? Does he get more radical on property rights?
I think his rhetoric does. I suppose he does to some extent. I mean, he's more radical than he was when he was the governor of New York. I think that's right. Whether he's really more radical than he was when he was serving as president, or whether he just felt himself constrained as president, I'm less sure about that. Whether he's reacting to psychological needs, I can't say. I don't do psychohistory so much, but it's pretty clear that he did miss being the man in the arena. But I'll defer to Paul.
Yeah, I think we're certainly the 1912 campaign was portrayed by a lot of people as just being Roosevelt's vendetta about his perception that his policies had been betrayed by Taft and the conservatives, the old guard in the Republican Party. And without being doing psychohistory, Roosevelt certainly did have that kind of personality, somewhat like Andrew Jackson, where he did tend to personalize these policy disputes, and it could be very moralistic. So I think that certainly had an important element in his decision to break up the Republican Party in 1912.
Yeah, that's always a question that comes up in our classes on the progressives. Is why did Roosevelt run again? was it a personal thing, or was it a principle thing? And probably both. But
having said, let me add a quick point that maybe conflicts with the point I just made a bit. Having said that, I don't do psychohistory. I guess I generally stand by that. But I mean, if we're on the subject, my reading of Roosevelt is that he's a very quixotic kind of character. I mean, in the literal original sense, he's a Don Quixote type. I mean, I think he seems, he says about himself that he was born um, in the silk stocking class, and there's a certain aspect of that formation. Maybe this is just aristocratic, the kind of disdain for the lower pursuit of the bourgeois class that has to earn its money. Or maybe it's a certain pride that revels in being a kind of traitor to the upper class. I'm not really sure, but he seems to have spent his life longing for heroic causes, plunging himself into heroic causes, and it's a tremendously picturesque and interesting life story as an illustration as a result of that. Um, but the moralizing, I think, kind of fits into that. He by calling him a kind of Don Quixote type, what I mean more specifically is that he spends his life, I think, looking for people in distress, whose condition he can relieve in a heroic way, and that gets broader and broader and more ambitious as his career goes on.
Yeah, in fact, Woodrow Wilson in the 1912 campaign, and Wilson knew the campaign was really between him and Roosevelt, was aware of this and was afraid. He says, look, Roosevelt's a dynamic, charismatic figure, and I'm a kind of a cold intellectual. He thought that was a big problem that he had to overcome in that campaign. And a lot of what Roosevelt was able to get done as president relied upon a kind of rhetorical flair, sort of his use of muckraking journalism to get the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act and things like that. So Roosevelt did have a sense of sort of the need for political dramatics, which was characteristic of a lot of 20th century presidents. But most of his opponents said that was exactly his problem, was that he was a threat to become a dictator, that he was an American Caesar. That there were no limits to what his ambitions were. Such was his thirst for glory and heroism that he would do anything. Mm-hmm. In fact, and indeed, Lincoln, in one of his first speeches, warns against exactly that kind of character. The tribe of the eagle and I forget what the other metaphor that he uses was, but the tendency for, in a republic, it's not going to be enough for men of Roosevelt's character to just preserve the institutions that have been handed on to us by the founders. They're going to seek something, some greater path of glory.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that was from Lincoln's speech at the Young Men's Lyceum, right?
Was that the first or the second? The temperance speech and that one were the
that was his first public speech, I believe, right? If I'm right, Peter, about that?
I think that's right. I know that did come before the temperance address. The temperance was 1842, and that was 1838. Yeah.
We have a lot of good questions coming in now, and since we're on this topic, I'll just throw this one out here. Maybe either of you could address this. Of course, Roosevelt is also associated with his military career. He's celebrated as a hero in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Did his military career have an impact on his presidency, or was that simply more symptomatic of his general character?
No, I think it did. There were important reforms in the American Army, for example, during the Roosevelt administration under, I think, Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War, because the Spanish-American War showed that the American Army was not up to sort of modern standards. And, so America's ended up being able to go into World War I with a much different military than it had in the 19th century. And Roosevelt's concern about, foreign policy, I think, looked at in the long perspective. He was more interested in foreign affairs and America's place as a world power than he was in a lot of these domestic reform matters. And that's quite appropriate because foreign policy and military stuff is constitutionally delegated to the president. So I think Roosevelt as commander-in-chief, Roosevelt as a diplomat was probably the major part of his presidency.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, that's really it. To that, just a small point or an added maybe dimension of it. You see in that, I don't know if that's part of the paradox of Roosevelt or if it just marks a certain discontinuity maybe between Roosevelt and present day progressives, that you see on the one hand this Well, I guess in some he could maybe be similar to a certain extent to Lyndon Johnson in this respect, but not to the progressives of our own day, in the sense that you have Roosevelt advocating um, very dramatic expansion of the federal government's scope and range of activities in domestic policy, and you also have him advocating um, military preparation, military buildup, and decrying the lack of preparation that he thinks. I mean, he's very severe with Jefferson and Madison for this, and he thinks that it's kind of a long-standing American problem to dismantle the military after every military conflict, and so you get this. What progressive Democrat today is saying both those things, right? That we need a large military buildup as well as a large buildup in administrative government. Maybe Jim Webb, who's barely a Democrat. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that the question had to do with what the military service, what impact it had on his presidency, and I guess I see a kind of a continuity between the foreign policy and the domestic policy, and at least rhetorically, this traces back to the point about moralism, that Roosevelt was forever declaring war on things. I mean, he was declaring war on I mean, not quite on the trusts, not on their existence, but war on the malefactors of great wealth, and war on corruption, and war on this and that. And there's a serious constitutional point in that, I think, that when you go to war with something, the powers of the executive expand. You kind of place the government on an emergency footing. But also, I think it's a mode, it's a condition that he was comfortable in, the fighting wars heroically. And so in that way, I think there's a continuity between the two.
Yeah. And in wartime and in foreign policy, you don't have to deal with Congress so much. You don't have to deal with the courts, who Roosevelt had a great disdain for. And I think one of the chief dynamics of 20th century progressivism, modern liberalism, is the introduction into domestic affairs of that kind of foreign policy approach to things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, this is great. I think Roosevelt in some ways had much more, at least for the next first, say, 2/3 of the 20th century, much more lasting impact on foreign policy. Not to downplay what he did domestically, but I think we can make the argument that in some ways he fundamentally transformed the way we think about the role of the United States in the world and how we go about moving through it. And I'd like to come back to that eventually, because I do think that's important. And we did ask people to read the excerpt from his State of the Union address, which has come to be known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But several of the things that you've been saying, both of you have raised some great questions, and I'm going to kind of lump some of them together because they're related. Actually, somebody just submitted that great quote from Roosevelt where he says, if I can find it, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord."
Yeah.
And the person who submitted, I don't see the name. I apologize. I interpret Armageddon as the power of big business over the power of individual citizens. Will you relate his comment and the power of increasing the executive power and governmental powers to reaching more toward an equality for the common man? I like the quote. It's tied into what you're just saying about declaring war on things. Armageddon is the war of wars in a way, right? So.
And it's also about declaring war and looking upon it as a kind of a holy war. In fact, if you look at the Progressive Party's convention in 1912, that's their sort of the culmination of, it's shot through with all kinds of social gospel progressivism. There was a kind of religious basis for a lot of the progressive movement that historians have really not paid enough attention to. And it had long roots going back into the 19th century to the pre-Civil War abolitionists and the Crusades against drink and gambling and Sabbath breaking and all that kind of stuff. And Roosevelt was comfortable being at the head of that kind of movement. If you look at the regular Republican convention in 1912, you see quite a contrast. And it was Elihu Root, who was the convention chairman, who drew a contrast in this that I think was right on, where he said, the founders' view of human nature was that it was fundamentally flawed, that human beings are finite beings, that we're, the Federalist Papers say all the time that we're depraved and wicked. And so you have to keep government limited because human beings can't be trusted with unlimited power. Whereas the liberal Protestantism of the social gospel in the late 19th century had a much more optimistic view of human nature and was much more willing to confer power on government to deal with all these problems that the churches had been traditionally ones to pay attention to. So that Armageddon culmination to that convention, I think, illustrates some profound cultural, religious differences between conservatives and progressives in this period.
And Paul, I think you just answered Joe's question
Yeah.
on whether that holy war of progressivism was more of a Protestant or a Catholic influence.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's obvious from that.
Yes.
Building on some of these things, some other great questions that have been submitted. Well, maybe just going off of what Paul was just talking about, somebody wanted to know, can we explain the difference between the new nationalism, the square deal? These are two terms that Roosevelt uses, and then they also added Wilson's new freedom in there. And then I thought maybe also, if you don't mind, can we talk a little bit about Roosevelt's critique of Taft and what their relationship was like? I find that fascinating because we know that Taft was sort of his chosen heir, right? And then there was that falling out. So can somebody want to touch on that a little bit, if you don't mind?
Which one would you like to take up first? The square deal, new nationalism one, or the Roosevelt and Taft one?
I would like that question, frankly, because I'm often confused over that. What is the new nationalism and what is the square deal? What is involved when Roosevelt throws those things out there? Are these official platforms? Are they two names for essentially the same thing? Do they reflect a general sort of philosophy of government? What does he mean by these terms?
Well, I take the square deal while he was president to mean that the government ought to intervene in a way that was just and equitable to both sides. Thinking of the 1902 anthracite coal strike, for example, and his intervention in that, saying that, well, capital and labor have a dispute here. In his view, the government had traditionally always taken capital's side, and that was unfair. And now, as he's going to be sort of a neutral umpire and bring the two sides together. In the new nationalism speech, though, the one that he gives at Osawatomie, he says he changes that. He says, when I say I stand for the square deal, I don't just mean enforcing fairly the existing rules of the system. I call for changing those rules when things have evolved in a way that will achieve a more substantial equality of opportunity. And I think that's fundamentally different. There he's talking about more of an equal outcomes view of what government should do. Government needs to intervene on one side, but this time on the side of labor against capital. You see this more fully developed in Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, in the Wagner Act of 1935, for example. So I think that's one of the changes between the Republican Roosevelt presidency, square deal, and the new nationalism of 1912.
No, that's very helpful, Paul. That actually helps put the New Deal, as Franklin Roosevelt calls it, into much more perspective versus a square deal.
Yep.
I guess
that's fascinating. Please.
Yeah, I would add to that by just emphasizing the sweepingly radical character of the new nationalism. I mean, this may be the result of an encounter with Crowley. It may be the result of TR being able to read and think a little more at leisure, when he's out of office. But I would connect it, I guess, with the Armageddon point too, in a certain sense, that I think TR makes that comment about Armageddon, and I think that one of the things he means by that is that he sees his present age as a period in which America is amid a kind of crisis. And the crisis is akin to the Civil War in the sense that he thinks that the prospects for genuinely democratic government are really imperiled. And I think that's the basic parallel he sees between himself and Lincoln, except the oligarchy, the character of the oligarchy that the American democracy is being threatened by is different, although Roosevelt seems to think not under the skin all that much different. So he sees himself at war for the really for the preservation of democracy. And I think that to him, the nationalism idea and the democracy idea are almost the same thing. That America will become fully democratic. You know, he uses the language of a social and industrial democracy as well as a political one, so far as the country becomes, or the governmental system becomes, much more constitutionally nationalist. And and in that way, I mean, I think that has a whole bunch of consequences that I won't. I mean, to try to explain all of them would be a long lecture, and I'm not gonna do that. Um, but this is very closely related to his emphasis on presidential government versus congressional government. And it's also very closely related to what turns out to be the real contribution of the progressive domestically administrative government within the executive branch. All of these things are functions, really, of his constitutional nationalism and his desire to perfect the American democracy, which is kind of ironic that administrative government becomes the rule of the unelected, but he thinks of that as a perfection, really, of the democratic cause in the United States. I mean, it's the playing out of one of Tocqueville's observations. The tendency of democracy will be toward centralization. And Tocqueville thought the genius of the U.S. Constitution was to resist that, and Roosevelt thought that that was its defect, and it needed to be modified so it didn't resist that. So I guess that much is my 2 cents about the new nationalism.
Yeah, I just like to add, whenever the progressives talk about democracy, you really have to be on your guard, because and a lot of what they did was, on a superficial level at least, trying to make government more responsive to the people and to encourage participation. Yet what you see is a really dramatic decrease in political participation that follows on a lot of these progressive reforms. And there were a lot of progressives who thought that keeping immigrants and blacks, for instance, from voting, changing the electoral system to reduce the influence of ethnic groups and those sorts of things was they were some of the leaders of that movement. So there's a real ambivalence among the progressives when they talk about democracy.
Yeah, I was going to. This is very interesting. I was going to ask about this term democracy that progressives frequently throw out. It seems like it means different things to different progressives, or it means multiple things to all progressives. There's democracy. Peter mentioned the direct democracy reforms of Roosevelt and others, giving the people more direct say and therefore control, in a way, at least on the surface, over what goes on in politics and government. But it seems to me that this points back to the beginning of the New Nationalism speech. Peter, you made me think about this. Without the new nationalism, that is, without the expansion of the control, regulatory power, and so on and so forth of the federal government, there is no possibility for a true democracy, he says. Which makes me think that the other essential aspect of democracy is, I don't want to reduce it simply to say that the needs of the people are met, but that there has to be ample opportunity for people to rise, to advance in life, to take advantage of the opportunities that Americans have traditionally been able to take advantage of. And it seems to me that it's tied, that sense of opportunity is tied much more for progressives to material prosperity and material opportunity, in a way. I'm losing my train of thought here. I apologize, but it seems like democracy means two things. There's sort of the mechanisms of democracy, primaries, direct primaries, and referendums and initiatives and these things. And then there's the essence of democracy, if I can use a term that Franklin Roosevelt throws around, which really in the end kind of boils down to a kind of equality. So the mechanisms of democracy aren't unimportant to a guy like Theodore Roosevelt. But what might be more important is as you were saying, Paul, I think the effect, the end result of it, this kind of equality that has to come out of it. If that's the more important aspect of what democracy is, then you may need this kind of then you need this expanded regulatory power and therefore administrative aspect of government under the leadership of stewards, administrative leaders.
That's interesting. That makes me think. I mean, all of these things really tie together. When we were talking about the Protestantism and the rhetoric about Armageddon, I think that ties in with what you're saying now, Chris, in the sense that um, there seems to be a kind of materialism in the, say, the social gospel of Walter Rauschenbusch, that you save the soul really by caring for people materially, and the moral reforms will more or less naturally follow from that. So you create this social and industrial democracy, and you make sure, you institute a regulatory and eventually redistributive regime to try to care for those who are relatively disadvantaged. And you suppose that out of this will come the qualities of initiative and enterprise and self-reliant citizenship that Roosevelt celebrates, and not the opposite, not the dependency that he did have actually a fair amount of contempt for. So yeah, there is that. And there is also, I guess, to come back to this point about democracy in a different way, the formal aspect of democracy. I think it is ironic that he wants to expand the power of voting rights, but in a certain sense, he and they, most of the progressives, but in a certain sense, to severely diminish the powers of Congress. That he sees the powers of Congress. He sees Congress as a realm of fragmentation, and the rule of special interests. And he sees the presidency as the only elected office that's representative of a genuine national interest, because it's the only one elected by the whole people of the United States. And all of this sets him apart from the founders' vision of it. Madison in 51 says that in Republican government, in popular government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And Roosevelt sees it just the opposite, that it's the executive authority that needs to predominate, because that's the one that's really truly representative of the people. But that means more and more the ceding of authority from the Congress to the executive branch, in the form of administrative agencies, who Roosevelt is very confident will be staffed by impartial experts who will really be essentially nonpartisan administrators. And all of that, I think, ties in with the you were calling it earlier, the optimism, the idealism, the kind of utopianism in some of the religious rhetoric, that they see human nature as perfectible in ways that the founders don't. More than that, they see as a kind of providential design, or as a historical process, humankind evolving toward the state of perfection. And one of the things that means, I'm speaking in the language of high theory here, I know, but one of the things that means is that administrative government replaces genuine politics. The politics, as the clashing of interests and the differing of partisan opinions, has to get shoved out. And we all agree on ends at a certain point, and all that's left to govern really is just to administer, to find the right means, and you can find impartial experts to do that. So on the one hand, the presidency is a great steward of the people. On the other hand, the people don't really govern themselves in a day-to-day basis anymore. So all of that is a scattering of thoughts theoretically, I guess.
No, that's fascinating. And in the middle of that, Peter, you mentioned, talked a little bit about Roosevelt's views on Congress, or the progressive view of Congress, and that's the realm of politics in the low sense, right? Special interests and control by business and things. And I'm glad you did that, because I think that helped to address a question. I think maybe Matt submitted it about Roosevelt's views on Congress and how well he worked with them. And I think that also helps to answer, at least in part, Roosevelt's critique of Taft, who he characterized, and at least in his autobiography, as sort of servant and errand boy of Congress, was unwilling to take a sort of strong, independent stand as the executive and therefore the steward of the people against Congress and congressional oversight and interference. So I thought that was very.
Pursuant to the thing I just said, I'm tempted to add to that Roosevelt, I mean, in certain of his more grandiose states of mind, he seems to have thought himself as kind of standing at the end of history and impatient with everybody else, that he's transcended politics, and Taft hasn't. Taft is still a creature of the special interests, and so Taft has to be denounced. It's not really a legitimate disagreement from the perspective of Roosevelt. It's Taft being reactionary. Taft hasn't evolved to the point that Roosevelt has in the historical process.
Yeah, that's a great point. By the way, that's a very Wilsonian description of Roosevelt, right? I mean, yeah. he's got historical insights that others don't. And I think if I can just mention quickly, that's the sense I get when I read the New Nationalism speech, because he begins with this sort of idea of the historical struggle that's a kind of an upward struggle, and Roosevelt is now sort of standing at that high point of that historical struggle, able to look back and see where we've come from and therefore also where we're going. I think that's an important point, and that view informs the thought of several progressives, including Roosevelt, but especially Woodrow Wilson. I think Wilson is almost the re-embodiment of Hegel in that sense, right?
Yeah.
We have so many great questions coming in as a result of your thoughts. This one was a little bit further back. I wanted to maybe bring this up. Somebody asked about, this was when we were talking about how in many ways Roosevelt's kind of a contradiction, or an enigma in ways. We know that he's talked big about trusts, and yet he had a fairly good relationship with several financial, let's call them titans, if you will, very powerful men, including J.P. Morgan. I'm going to tie these two questions together if anybody wants to address them. What was his relationship with men like J.P. Morgan? And what were his views on banking in general? Did he have an impact on the creation of the Federal Reserve? And Paul, I think you've written about this.
Yeah, his relationship with Morgan is interesting because Morgan was an important campaign contributor. And the story goes that when Roosevelt leaves the presidency and goes off on his African hunting trip, that Morgan says, let every lion do his duty. That he was an enemy of Roosevelt's, but they had a complicated relationship. I think that the chief thing was that Roosevelt wanted to make sure that Morgan and people like him, knew their place. That the government was superior to the trust, to these economic organizations. And so Roosevelt, again, sort of dramatically, and for reasons that had nothing to do with economics. Roosevelt didn't know very much about economics, let alone finance, banking. What he was interested primarily in was that the people saw that the federal government was superior to these economic organizations. Because I'm sure U.S. Steel probably had a bigger budget than the whole federal government in 1901, employed more people. So you had the tremendous power of these new economic organizations, especially relative to the states, who were at least nominally the creators, the incorporators of these bodies. So for Roosevelt, it was a matter of perception, a matter of image, not so much about market share. His antitrust views were sort of about they're more morally and emotionally based than they were economically based. He did. There's a very interesting story in 1907, in the financial panic of 1907. Roosevelt arranged the bailout of the Knickerbocker Trust Company. In order to do that, he had to assure J.P. Morgan and his friends and U.S. Steel that if they acquired the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, he wouldn't enforce the antitrust laws against them. And they went ahead and did that, and that turned out to be a big scandal because they were able to buy TCI for a fraction of what it was really worth. But Roosevelt felt it's a lot like in 2008, 2009, in the middle of a financial panic. Roosevelt thought the president has to intervene and take care of the stability of the American economy. But he didn't know much about economics or finance. And it looked like in that situation that he was really taken advantage of by the people who did.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Um, I thought we have about 15 minutes. Peter, unless you wanted to add anything to that.
No, that's an area of Roosevelt's life and career I don't know that much about. I'm learning from Paul as we're going on.
Yeah, that was very. I had no idea. I thought maybe with our last 15 minutes, maybe we should segue a little bit to his impact on foreign policy, and as a way to do that, Candy asked about or brought up the seizure of American Indian lands at the turn of the century and under Roosevelt. How do we think about Roosevelt's relations with American Indians? Is it a good relationship? Bad relationship? Maybe that's not the right question, but beneficial.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but I think Roosevelt said it. I've been accused of saying that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. But I never said that. I believe that 9 out of 10 are, and I wouldn't inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. But I don't know if that's an actual a quote from it. But certainly Roosevelt had views on race and the development of races within America and around the world that strike us today as being quite benighted. Again, this is quite common among the progressives, and you mentioned Hegel. It sort of goes back to him that different races, different groups of people were in different stages of evolutionary development. And Roosevelt firmly believed that the Anglo-Saxons or the Aryans were the leaders in this. And I think for Roosevelt, it meant that we had an obligation to bring along the inferior races, as he called them, down this path of evolutionary development. And that explains his views on imperialism, as well as a lot of his domestic views about blacks and Native Americans.
Yeah, they would describe them as somehow historically behind, so to speak. What do we call people today? Developing peoples.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right? They're not as advanced or civilized. Those are the less politically correct terms that they often used back then.
I think we might even be past those terms. I mean the terms of development and underdevelopment. To all of that, I would just add. I mean, any who are interested in the question, Roosevelt wrote a lot. He was an enormously energetic fellow as a writer as well as an activist in certain ways. And so he wrote several volumes on the winning of the West, for one, and he wrote a biography on Thomas Hart Benton, senator from Missouri, who was a big 19th century senator, big advocate of westward expansion. And the point of those, or at least a main point in those works, is as Paul says, Roosevelt was a believer in manifest destiny. I mean, Roosevelt believed it was the destiny of the United States to expand from sea to shining sea. And that means that it was the fate of the Native Americans. Well, I don't know if I should say to be subordinated, but at least to have their lives radically transformed. It was the fate of the better way to say it maybe is this: it was the fate of the Native Americans to give way to this advancing civilization, which Roosevelt would have said, did say that they're welcome to join, if they can be assimilated into it. But there's no sense of respect for what we call cultural diversity in Roosevelt. There's this idea that we're an advanced civilization, they're not. And so it's really for their benefit that we, if need be, we conquer them and assimilate them. He didn't think that all peoples could be assimilated, apparently, or at least not very easily, to the American civilization. This is a little apart from the question, but not so far. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the laws for the exclusion of Chinese immigrants, for instance, because he didn't think that they were assimilable. I don't think he quite thought that about Native Americans, but he was. As he says Easterners should not be sentimental about the wars against the Indians. That if they want to assimilate, good, but if they have to be conquered, then we should be unsentimental about conquering them. in this way too. Roosevelt says things that are very much at odds with what virtually everybody thinks in the present day.
Yeah, you mentioned Thomas Hart Benton and his speech on the destiny of the race sometime in the 1840s, around the time of the Mexican War, is a good illustration of that kind of, proto-progressive view of racial development. A contemporary of Roosevelt's would be Albert Beveridge. His support of imperialism, his March of the Flag speech, and he was very close to Roosevelt. He was either chairman of the Progressive Convention in 1912, or was he? I remember, was he even Roosevelt's running mate in 1912? Albert Beveridge?
That's a great question. I have to look that up.
Yeah, I got to look that up too. That sounds right to me, but I'd have to look that up too.
Yeah, but Beveridge was, Paul, you mentioned Beveridge. Well, Beveridge, when it comes to foreign policy issues, and especially this question of, our flirtation with imperialism and the not just the right, but in a way the duty. At least this is the language that Beveridge and Roosevelt both commonly use. The United States has not just a right, but they argued that we had a duty to govern certain uncivilized or less civilized peoples, and this extended to the Philippines, right? The people of the Philippines, and to a certain extent, even the Cubans. The Cubans were a little more historically advanced and civilized. They had a little more advantage over other peoples of the world. But it seems to me that one of the major shifts that takes place in foreign policy at that time, and Peter, you mentioned this earlier. This is not an aspect that actually persists with progressives today, at least on the surface. But one of the major shifts is that the United States, as long as we can govern other peoples, both in the Western Hemisphere and outside of the Western Hemisphere. We can govern them so long as it's done for one or both of two reasons. It's good for the people being governed in the sense that we're going to help them sort of advance culturally or scientifically or technologically, or however we want to put it, right? Help them sort of get caught up historically. Or two, if it's good for the general advancement of civilization or mankind, right? Toward this, again, this sort of ideal notion of what the world is meant to become. And I think I'm rambling a bit. I apologize, but it seems to me that the language anyway, that Beveridge and Theodore Roosevelt uses is virtually identical. I see virtually no disagreement among them over this idea that, look, if the United States needs to conquer and govern, and maybe in some cases wipe out. I mean, there's one speech where Roosevelt actually, I don't have the speech in front of me, Roosevelt actually says, there may be some races that, and by races, I think he generally means cultures or societies, that stand in the way of human progress and may need to be swept aside.
Nobody's going to miss them.
It's quite shocking.
Yeah, who's quite explicit about that.
Yeah, some of that language is quite shocking to us today.
Mm-hmm.
It follows from his belief in a kind of social evolution. He was an evolutionist, like a lot of the progressives were. Yeah, I on the prior point you were making about the purposes of the imperialism. You said earlier in the discussion, Chris, you indicated you commented on the really large influence in his legacy that TR has, especially in American foreign policy, and I think that's right. That it's not so much, you don't want to describe it as imperialism, and it isn't the kind of conquer and hold, just acquisitive kind of imperialism, maybe that you find espoused in Machiavelli, but as pursuant to a desire to democratize the world, to civilize the world, and also pursuant to a great confidence that we know how to do it, that we're the democratizers, we're the advanced civilization. There's a sense in which there are versions of that in both parties, that the legacy is a bipartisan legacy, which maybe sets it apart from the domestic policy legacy, which seems to be more of a partisan matter.
Oh, that's a great point. It strikes me that it's not so much that way of thinking about America's responsibilities in the world. It's not simply a liberal um, way of thinking about things in the later 20th century, or a democratic way of thinking about things. There are a number of Republicans who adopted that notion of a kind of mission in the world. But it does seem to me that way of thinking about things also underlies Roosevelt's justification for an expanded role of the United States, even in the Western Hemisphere, and in what's come to be known as the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. My sense is that the way he's talking about the need for it's not even what was traditionally called preemptive action, almost a preventive action on the part of the United States to step in cases like, for example, Cuba. I know we went into Cuba, I think 3 times, just in the early 1900s. Several other Latin American countries. We step in when those nations act in a way that is unacceptable for a civilized nation. We need to step in, sometimes with economic advisors, sometimes with administrators, sometimes with the military, to make sure that they're conducting themselves as a civilized nation should. And it seems to me that leads to all kinds of interventionism, especially under Roosevelt. But of course, Woodrow Wilson continued that, and there have been other presidents that sort of flirted with that a little bit in the Western Hemisphere.
Sure. Lyndon Johnson did it in 1965.
Right.
Lyndon Johnson did it in 1965 in the Dominican Republic. I think that usually what would happen was that these Latin American countries would run up debts with European powers, and Roosevelt has some legitimate national security concern here that the European powers would use that as an excuse to reassert themselves in the Western Hemisphere. Likewise, with the Philippines and others, as the Spanish Empire was decaying, advocates of imperialism could say, look, the realities of world politics are that the Philippines are not going to be independent. If we don't govern them, somebody else will. And we probably would do a better job than the Germans or the French or the Japanese in these countries. So there were some legitimate sort of bases in realpolitik about some of these foreign policy matters, completely separate from the racial theory involved in them.
That's a great point. Yeah, this is all taking place in the age of colonialization, and that's a great point. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm trying to see if we've got any recent questions that have come in. How about this one? Here's a fun one for the last 2 minutes. Would Theodore Roosevelt ever have a chance to get elected as president?
Actually, I heard reading there were a group of conservative historians and social scientists who were very hostile to Donald Trump. And one of them pointed out, well, Trump has been likened to, Hitler or to Mussolini or to whatever, but they were making the claim that historically the person he most resembles is Theodore Roosevelt. Especially one of the points we didn't get to talk about, I think one of the central institutions in this period is the political party. And Roosevelt and the progressives' general hostility to political parties is something that's really important in the transformation of how American democracy worked. So, Roosevelt really did upend the whole mechanism, the whole procedure of electoral politics. He won some of the first primaries. A couple of states had primaries in 1912. Roosevelt won them, including in Taft's own state of Ohio. And he began there to make out the claim that this was what legitimated somebody getting the nomination. Not the party bosses, not the party machine, but rather the direct appeal of this presidential candidate to the people.
Yeah, that's great.
I would say that one of the reasons today, the way that people get elected president is largely due to Theodore Roosevelt and progressive reform.
That's very interesting.
Let me add a couple of quick thoughts about that. Let me preface my thought by saying that that in very important respects, Donald Trump does not deserve any kind of comparison with Theodore Roosevelt, in the sense that, Roosevelt was both, I mean, enormously energetic and accomplished. One cannot imagine Donald Trump writing 4 volumes of a well-regarded American history, for instance, or bios of anybody else. So, you know, intellectually, yeah, exactly, right. So intellectually, there's no comparison whatsoever. But having said that, you know, you think about it a little bit. I mean, in ways that would seem maybe to his followers positive and in 1 or 2 ways negative, there really are parallels in the kind of appeal they make. There's this unabashed pro-Americanism. You know, there's a kind of populism, a disgust with party elites that are captured by various kinds of self-interest. There's this sort of aggressively assertive manliness in the anti-PC rhetoric. There's crony capitalism, really. I mean, I think that's the implication of TR's administrative government. He wouldn't accept that, but I think that really is the implication of it. And there's certainly that in Donald Trump. There's the advertisement of an omnicompetent, you know, rule of experts kind of government that rises above party politics. All of that is sort of a populism that I think that there is a kind of continuity. The question asked, you know, could he get elected? TR would have a better chance than Donald Trump, but I'm not sure in either case.
That's fascinating. You have to wonder. Matt just submitted the last question and raised a thought in my mind about that. You have to wonder if what's going through the minds of Republicans today about what Trump will do, were the same sorts of things weren't going through the minds of Republicans back when Roosevelt was considering another run.
You know, I should add to that one more point. I mean, there's a sense in which you could consider, from the perspective of the original founders, TR anti-constitutionalist, and Trump clearly is that too. So there's that also.
That's great. Well, maybe we should end on that. Is that a high point? I'm not sure. But I thank you both very much. I've learned a great deal from our conversation, and thank you both for being here and sharing your thoughts with us all.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all the students for submitting the questions.
Yeah, yes. Thanks for they're very good questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to address all of them. But very stimulating.
Yeah, great question today. So,
Paul, I learned a lot. Good to meet you.
Thanks to you.
Well, we'll try to do it again sometime. Hopefully, we'll have another chance. And again, thanks to everybody who joined us and for the great questions. If you've enjoyed the conversation today, consider looking into a course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. This is kind of how we do things. We pick some interesting figures and texts, documents, and have conversations. You can find out more about those courses at our website, teachingamericanhistory.org. Also, just a reminder, you'll be receiving an email with the link to request a certificate of participation. Our next webinar will be Saturday, February 13th, 11 o'clock Eastern Time, and it will be on Franklin Roosevelt through Depression and War. And I'll be joined by David Krugler of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville and Stephen Tootle of the College of the Sequoias. So I hope to see you again then. Until then, best wishes and take care.